It is Friday, so we're going to jump into yet again another Transformer Slag podcast Patreon listener question. Once again, if you want to be part of the Transformer Slag podcast Patreon, help support the podcast. Let us know we're doing a half-decent job here in the Transformer world. Check it out, patreon.com/Protoman, or check the pinned comment or the description below. What does it get you if you join the Patreon? Well, it gets your name in the end credit scroll at the end of every segment moving forward, access to our exclusive Discord where we share lore, share news, break the news, all kinds of cool stuff there. You save money on your hobby with our sales section where you save tons of money in this crazy expensive hobby. I want you to save a couple of bucks buying your retail Transformers. And of course, we do giveaways. We send stuff in the mail. Whole bunch of stuff planned with the future TFCons coming up with exclusives that I give to free to patrons. So there's a lot of good stuff going on if you join the Patreon. I can't stress it enough. And it's just a good bunch of crew of people at the Discord. So be sure to check that out. And again, we have a Patreon listener question that we have here today at the Patreon listener question tier. And it comes from our longtime patron, one of our very first patrons too, Massive Gains. Shout out to Massive Gains for being with us for, 5+ years at this point. And he writes, "Hey, Protoman, I got an interesting question for you that I was debating among my crew of friends. Who was the very first Transformer army builder character? Also, do you take part in army building, and which is your favorite? P.S. Why don't you follow anyone on social media, brah? Just kidding. Lots of love for what you do. Massive Gains." First to cover that one with the social media thing. You know what? I have Instagram. I have Twitter. I use it to put out my content. If people want to follow me, hey, that's great. But I don't really follow anybody. You don't hurt any feelings, and you don't have to watch any negativity at the same time too. So that's kind of my stance on social media. Again, I have a Twitter. I use it. But I don't really pay attention to it. I just kind of go, hey, check out my stuff. So that's kind of what those are for, to answer that one. But yeah, so to go into the army building question. So for people that don't know what that is, army building was really something that started in the toy community with the Star Wars and the G.I. Joe community. Two brands that really, the bad guy side of things, had a lot of generic troops and stuff. And so if you really wanted to do these really crazy displays of showing off stuff, you would army build. And Star Wars, especially the early Star Wars stuff, almost kind of encouraged it with a lot of the photos that they had with their stormtroopers in their own packaging back in the late 70s and early 80s. You'd have these shots of them advertising the toys with multiple of the same stormtrooper toy. So that kind of started the army building thing, and fans, of course, would buy multiple stormtroopers, or in the case of G.I. Joe, multiple Cobra troopers, or Crimson Guard or anything like that, or bats, and then just army build. And it was a very common thing in those two properties and the people who collected those two properties. Transformers has it, but in a much more unique kind of way. Transformers has always been a lot about the uniqueness of the individual of the characters, and while there is a form of army building in it, it's not as, I guess, common as it is and more well-known as, say, the Stormtroopers or the Cobra Troopers. And I've seen, there's photos online that are just massive, of hundreds and hundreds of army builders of those two brands. So to go to your question, what is the first one? What truly was the first one? Well, that's where it gets kind of dicey because, when you talk about like even the first couple of episodes of G1, you kind of end up, it's like, okay, you have the generic purple Seeker Troopers, right? So those didn't really have a toy until years later, so you couldn't really engage in army building with the generic purple Seeker Warriors, the Air Warriors, I believe they're called. They would get a PVC many years ago, and that was it. And we're not talking like Hot Link or any of those individual characters. We're talking just generic troop building kind of thing. So he did, he, she, whatever you want to label those generic Seekers, they weren't really the first. They were definitely in the fiction, they were there. But at the end of the day, they didn't have any toys, so we can't really fall into that army builder kind of story. And when we talk army builders, we're talking like a lot of the same character. Some could argue, well, aren't the Seekers themselves army builders? Not in the same way. We're talking buying the same figure, buying the same character over and over and over to army build, as opposed to like Thundercracker, Skywarp, Starscream, and saying that's an army of building that because it's the same mold. But they're separate toys, they're different characters, different color schemes. So it's kind of that kind of thing. The second one that comes up, and then you have like the Insecticons, also early G1, and you're going like, well, they do clones of themselves, and is that army building? Some could say that that was the very first example of that. You could go out, you could buy those Insecticons, you could buy multiples of them and say, oh, we're army building in that. But they're clones, and so, that kind of falls into that weird area too, where are they army building? Are they not? And that's really your own personal opinion with that. It's also kind of the same thing that happens with Reflector and the crazy amount of animation errors they used in those early episodes to bolster the Decepticon ranks by having all these Reflector units in the background. When I would write the Bakon bio many years later for Flash Century, I mentioned the Photons and how they were brought in to bolster the ranks in the early days of the Great War and stuff to kind of make sense of those animation errors. A little bit of a good old Sakamoto plot-filling device, as I like to call it, that I did there. So, you could argue also Reflector. And again, he had toys too, but those toys didn't really, for lack of better words, reflect how it looked on television. So, do you just take that center viewfinder character and just say that's the one that you're going to buy multiple times to army build? Talk about an expensive way to be army building. Probably I'd have to say the Insecticons were the first. They technically were the first, but they're not the one that a lot of people associate with army building, because when you really get to the 1986 movie, that's when army building really becomes a thing, because we didn't get just one, we got 3 different kinds of casts of characters to army build with the 1986 Transformers movie. We got the Sweeps, which of course you could take that 1986 Scourge mold. You had the Sharkticons, which you could use that 1986 Gnaw mold, the Sharkticons, and the Junkions, which again 1986 Wreck-Ar mold. So you had already 3 built-in little army building segmentations there, and you could use toys that were available on the shelves at the time to kind of build up those armies. Granted, Junkions have uniqueness amongst themselves, but every so often you have a character that looks exactly the same in those units, as opposed to the Sharkticons and the Sweeps that really kind of all look the same. So it kind of really started with the 86 movie. And, you could jump forward. I mean, I could go into Master Force with the Seacons and stuff like that. The next big one that I could really think of that people could really go to right away is Beast Machines. Beast Machines had tons of army building in that, all the different Viacon generals, and then all their army builders from it, the tank drones, the cycle drones, the jet drones, the copter drones, the artillery drones with Stryka. I could go on and on. Even the extended lore within the toy lore, like toy bio lore, where there was other Viacon generals and their leaders and stuff like Mirage and them. So you could army build like crazy just from Beast Machines alone. And then, of course, going into Transformer Prime with the Viacon drones there, and I could go on and on. So there's a lot of that, just to kind of give people a perspective of it. So the question is, the first one, I'd have to go either with the Insecticons if you want to go into the clones and stuff, or really lean more on the 86 characters being some of the very first. But Insecticons technically were the first true army builders in toys for Transformers. It's funny because when you look at even from a toy perspective, army building didn't really become a keyword in the Transformer community until we got to Bakon, where Bakon started doing army builder packs. And they did that for a couple of years in a row, like in 2009. And it's kind of funny because it emulates a little bit of what the 86 movie did. 2009 Bakon, you got the Sweeps. 2010 Bakon, you got the Sharkticons. 2011, you got the Auto Troopers. We'll get into that in a moment. 2012, we got the Shatterglass Junkions. And I could go on and on, Granted, the Junkions had unique head sculpts and everything, but it still kind of leaned in their army builder packs. After that, in 2013 going onwards, their army builder, and I use air quotes here, sets went more with unique colorings and designs like the Rainmakers. And then, of course, afterwards, the Wodoros members. And they finally ended in 2016 with the Reflector Army Builder 3-pack. Again, something that I wrote for and explains the photons and why there were so many of them. And, Yeah, so it kind of all goes for full circle with that. Sure. So the question is then, do I partake in army building, and what is my favorite? I don't, you know what? The only time I ever really did it, unless of course, buying these army builder packs where you can't control ending up with 3 of them. But the only time I ever did it, purposely was I think during Transformers Prime, when they did those Viacon drones, when they did like the multiple different kinds too, like the flight ones and the road ones. I purposely bought some extras of the legend scale just to kind of like bolster a little army of them. And to this day, it's probably the only time I purposely built an army of army building characters, because they were cheap too. It's legend scale. You could buy a bunch of them and they don't take a lot of space. So that's the only time I really did it on purpose. I mean, of course, I have all those army builder sets from Bakon, but never bought like multiples of sweeps. If I did buy multiples of sweeps, it's because there was a variant or something. Never bought multiples of Sharkticons or Junkions or stuff like that. Always kind of just, doing a thing. Even the going back to the purple generic Seeker, I have that PVC of it, which they give you 3 of them. And again, I didn't do that on purpose. That's just how it's sold. So I ended up with 3 of them. So the only time I'd have to say I actually partaked in army building was those Transformer Prime Viacon drones. But they aren't my favorite. If I had to pick one that I thought was probably my favorite of all the Viacons, of all the army building drones and stuff like that, I'd probably have to go with the Auto Troopers. I really like those like Kiss Blade Auto Troopers, more specifically the animated mold from Bakon, because those ones were fantastic mold, nice and crisp, great design, great head sculpt on it, nice coloring. Definitely probably of all the stuff in Transformers, those animated Auto Trooper drones are probably the coolest ones of the bunch. So I'd have to go with those. I mean, I know Derek White. Derek had like a whole army of those. He bought like multiple packs of those ones, and that's probably something expensive to army build. But luckily you get 3 in a 3-pack, so you're on a good start already. But he had he had to have like 2 dozen or something. He had to have, like, I'll try to find a photo of it, but I remember he had a lot back in the day. Rest in peace, Derek, man. But yeah, that's kind of it. That's kind of it, more or less. Like, there's so many I know I'm forgetting, but there's a lot of different kind of army building segmentation in Transformers, but those are just some that I could give. And I mean, say your favorite. I mean, some people really like collecting the sweeps now that we kind of, we're entering a world now where now Hasbro recognizes the army building thing and uses that to go, okay, well, we could take previously existing molds, tool them just a little bit and play into that army building thing. How we got the sweep from the studio series, getting all the different Junkions throughout the years. I'm pretty sure we're going to get plenty and plenty and plenty and plenty of different Sharkticon repaints and stuff outside of the ones that we already did get. So it's something that it lends to itself, and we keep seeing it more and more. Again, we see it already through the Seekers, but the Seekers are all individual characters, more or less. We're talking the true way of army building, which is buying that same toy over and over and over, like they did with the Stormtroopers. So let me know what you think. Who's your favorite? And if you want to be like Massive Gains with a really awesome question, a profound one, if you will. I like these ones where you have to think and talk about stuff. But if you want to be like Massive Gains and be part of the Transformer Slag podcast Patreon, again, patreon.com/Protoman, or check the pinned comment or description below. Tomorrow is the Saturday night live stream, so be sure to pop in for that. We're back to our normal schedule doing these Saturday night live streams. And rock out with the robots in the skies, and I will see you tomorrow.